Okay, so in order for a behavior to be under natural selection, or if it can evolve under natural selection, it has to be variable, as I've just indicated here. It has to be heritable. That means that parents need to be able to transmit genes associated with behavior from parent to offspring. And though the differences in behavior have to be related to differences in fitness or reproductive success, lifetime reproductive success. Okay. Here is, this is just a quick little table to indicate different types of trait variation. So we'll talk, if you're in my evolutionary biology class, you'll definitely see this again. But we can look at trait variation in two ways. One is in a discrete variation, in terms of discrete variation. And when I say discrete, I mean that there are very specific types of behavior. And it'll be more clear what I mean in a second. And then there is continuous variation. And continuous variation simply means that, think of height, right? Height is a continuous trait. That is that if you were to take, all of the measure height for like 100 people, it would probably form, a bell-shaped curve, what we call a normal curve, right? That is the distribution of that trait would be, some individuals, a few individuals would be very short. A few would be very, very tall. Most people falling somewhere in the middle, right? So you've got this kind of what we call a bell-shaped curve or a normal curve. If you've taken statistics, you'd know exactly what I mean. In contrast, discrete variation means that there are specific types. There is no sort of normal distribution. There are simply categories, right? Of whether an animal is red or blue or purple, for example. Those might be discrete, that might be discrete variation in a trait. And in behavior, we can think about that as well. There may be behavioral traits that are discrete in that way. And there are different ways that we can assess whether these traits are heritable or not. The one is, so if we're looking at discrete variation, we can look at sort of Mendelian inheritance of traits, right? And it's taking what we call more population genetics approach. Whereas when we look at continuous traits, like let's say continuous variation in a behavioral trait, we use quantitative genetics, right? So we try to actually measure heritability of the trait. And I'll walk you through what that means. Now, again, if you're taking evolutionary biology with me, this is all going to be, you'll become very intimately familiar with, with these terms and so on. Okay. Here's a question. What does it mean when a biologist states there is a gene for behavior X or there is a genetic basis for behavior X? How many times have you heard that something is genetic, right? So the first approach is the answer, I guess, one answer is that behavior X is heritable. That is that the variation in the trait, at least some of it, is related to genetic influences. We can measure the relative contribution of genes or of genetics to overall variation in a trait. Okay, and that proportion of genetic variation is called heritability. And that's what this here is describing, this equation. So if you look at the equation here, h squared is that's a term used for heritability. And if we were to look at, let's say you were to measure a behavioral trait across, let's say it's, I don't know, let's say running speed is a behavioral trait, for example. Not that it really is necessarily, but let's just call it that. And you have, the total variation in that trait, right? Some individuals are very slow, some are very, very fast. And we can partition that variation into that's derived from genetic influences, that is, it's derived from genes, and variation due to the environment. And the proportion that is due to genetic influences is called heritability. So that number can range from 0 to 1. The higher the number, the more heritable a trait is. And so basically it's, I mean, there's this chocolate cake analogy. And the idea here is that there's lots and lots of genes that contribute, or lots and lots of, how do I put this? There's lots and lots of ingredients that go into making a chocolate cake, right? You can consider each of those ingredients like a gene, right? And so multiple genes go into the cake, and we can't necessarily, you can remove some genes, you can like try to manipulate the recipe to try to see what the outcome is on the cake, but you can't necessarily pinpoint which genes do what for a particular trait in this context. It's just very difficult. There's lots and lots of genes in these quantitative traits that contribute to their variation. There are ways, though, that we can try to assess the heritability of a trait. In particular, we're interested in behavior, of course. And these are used also in other traits, morphological or physiological traits. Common one is, parent-offspring regression. So this is basically where you plot parents against offspring and look at the slope of that line. And that slope indicates, the steeper the slope, the more heritable the trait is. We're going to talk about intelligence and the heritability of intelligence. And in that case, there's lots of use of twin studies to try to look at, the genetic consequences, or should I say the genetic contribution to intelligence while controlling for environmental differences, for example. Another big one is common garden experiments and artificial selection experiments. We'll walk you through what some of those might look like. I won't go through all these, but. So the big question, if we're going to understand behavior and we want to understand how behavior evolves and how can it evolve and how it can become adaptive, we need to think about how heritable are behavioral traits. How are behavioral traits highly variable, highly heritable? That is, is there a strong influence of genetics on behavior, or is most of the variation in behavior a result of the environment? This is a critical question. The one thing I want to point out, though, is in most cases, and I'll talk about this a little later, it's just that there is no such thing as like environment versus genes, right? Really. I mean, there's, you've heard of this nature versus nurture type of debate. The fact is that in terms of most traits, including especially behavior, both genes and the environment contribute to variation in behavioral traits. And that'll become more clear in a minute. So if we think about discrete variation, these are often completely genetically determined. That is, that there is no room for variation from the environment. And so these are determined through Mendelian processes, right? Just like Mendel and his peas, some peas were wrinkled and others were not, and that was based on a single gene, a single allele, a single locus, I should say, with multiple alleles. So is with some traits. So for example, things like tongue rolling. How many of you can do this? Like roll your tongue like, I don't know about this young girl on the right, but the guy here on the left, rolling your tongue like a taco is a genetically determined trait. That is, that if you have the gene associated with that, you can do it. If you don't, you can't. It's discrete variation. Sort of yes or no. You can or you can't do it. Now all of you are trying it, I'm sure, but it is genetically determined. And this is an example of discrete variation in mating behavior in a bird. So I've put this paper or a paper on D2L for you to look at based on this as well. These are what are called ruffs. These are shorebirds that they perform, their mating behavior is quite complex. They form what are called leks. So there are males, what are called independent males, that basically guard a very small territory in a large sort of open space. And so if you were to walk in and see this, you would see, scattered around all of these little males strutting around in their own little, what we call them leks. It's a lek, L-E-K. And they are basically displaying for females. So females come along and they choose a male to mate with based on their performance on the lek. Okay, so you have one kind of male, this independent male, which is sort of the, this is the typical male behavior, right? Strutting around, trying to attract a female. And then there are alternative, what we call alternative reproductive tactics. These are other males that have a different strategy, a different mating behavior. And this mating behavior, so the first is a satellite. So these are males that basically hang around. They don't guard their own little lek territory. And when there's an opportunity, they will mate with a female, right? So the females may or may not choose them, but they don't have the same mating behavior. That is that they're not, like I said, strutting around defending a lek like the other males. So these are satellite males that are like hanging around and basically trying to mate with the females when an opportunity arises. There's even a third type of male called a female mimic. So this is a male that can basically wander around, doesn't get harassed by other males in terms of being sort of beaten up by other males who may be trying to suppress the success of any rivals. This is a female mimic, and so this male basically can sidle up to females and mate with them without incurring any of the costs associated with fighting with other males. And that's because the other males don't recognize the female mimic as anything but another female. So anyway, these kinds of strategies, mating behaviors, are actually not uncommon. So there's lots of species, for example, fish. There's a bluegill sunfish that has a similar pattern. So this is not unusual. What is unusual about these birds is that the behavior that they elicit is determined genetically. That is that using pedigree analysis, it's, on these birds, they've been able to look and find Mendelian ratios associated with these different morphs, if you will, these different types. And it's pretty clear that there's a single polymorphic gene with 2 or 3 alleles that control what developmental path these birds will take, these males, in terms of whether they will become an independent male, a female mimic, or one of these satellite males. So the dominant, autosomal allele is the satellite male, in fact. And anyway, it's just all to say that the developmental trajectory of these birds, these males, is determined by a single polymorphic gene. So this is an example of discrete variation across these 3 different types of males. Similarly, we see something in isopods. These are marine isopods that have a very similar strategy, I guess, set of strategies. You have the big alpha male territorial, you have a beta, which functions as a female mimic, and then you have these what are called gamma males that are sneaker males in the same, functioning in a similar way as what we saw with the satellite males in the rough. And again, it's a single polymorphic gene based in, and this is determined through pedigree analysis. And what that means is that they basically do a series of matings across different, with males and females, but the different types of males. They look at the ratio of the number of males of the 3 different types, and they can conclude based on those ratios that this is consistent with a single polymorphic gene with 3 alleles. So the sort of Mendelian genetics that you're familiar with applies to these animals. And they're, it's not just their behavior, of course, it's a whole suite of traits that are associated with this polymorphism. There's also continuous variation. So what I've just described to you here are examples of discrete variation. There's continuous variation as well. That is that, you could have variation in a behavioral trait that follows more of a normal or bell-shaped curve. And here's an example looking at garter snakes. So on the bottom right, you can see a garter snake eating a frog. That is sort of the typical diet of inland garter snakes. But there is a population of garter snakes that live in coastal California that are derived from the inland population. That is, we call the inland population then the ancestral population. But this coastal population of garter snakes has evolved a preference for eating banana slugs, which are not available inland. And so we can ask questions about preference, prey preference in these garter snakes, and ask about, variation and heritability about that. And so here, this is an experiment that was performed with these snakes. You can do what essentially is called a common garden experiment. You can take snakes, I can't remember if garter snakes are live bearing or they lay eggs. I think they lay eggs, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, you take snakes that are either recently hatched or recently born, you bring them into the lab, and you rear them in isolation from other snakes and from the prey that you're interested in. So if you're looking at prey preference in these garter snakes, you would feed them something other than what you're trying to test, right? So that they can be naive to when, they're live bearing. Thank you, Samantha. So you can expose, in this case, this naive snake to a cotton swab here that has been sort of had slug extract, slug slime sort of rolled over it. And you can assess the preference that these snakes might have for various types of food items. And if this behavior is genetically based, then we would expect that naive snakes from coastal populations should have a behavior that's consistent with preference for those slugs, right? So here is some results of this. And here you've got the number on the x-axis is the number of tongue flicks that are given towards this cotton swab with the slug extract. And along the y-axis is the percentage of snakes that give these numbers of tongue flicks. So this is an average. This is clearly an average number of tongue flicks. The flicking of the tongue reflects the preference of the snake. So the more the snake flicks its tongue, the more the increased preference they have for that particular prey item. And what you see here is fairly clearly that these naive snakes from coastal areas in blue, the blue bars, tend to have a higher preference for the slug extract. That is that they are on average flicking their tongue towards that slug extract far more than, naive inland snakes. So this suggests that this preference that these snakes have is innate, and that it is genetically determined, in part at least. And I just want to point out that this is a continuous trait, right? That is that some snakes, from the coastal areas flick their tongue very little, if at all, towards towards the slug extract. And some, are super interested in the slug extract by flicking their tongue much more. But when you look at the proportion of where most of the tongue flicking takes place, it's clear that the coastal naive snakes have a distinct preference for the slug extract compared to snakes from the inland. Okay, so this suggests that this preference, this behavior, reflects an evolved difference between these two populations. So we can also ask, what would, hybrids between snakes that come from inland versus the coast should have an intermediate prey preference. And in fact, that seems to be the case based on some studies. So there is some evidence that, that this is an evolved preference, that this behavior has evolved, and that snakes that are on the coast have evolved a preference for these slugs. Now, why they have evolved a preference for the slugs is a different question, right? Obviously, the slugs only occur in the coastal area compared to the interior. Why they may be interested in eating those slugs over other food items like frogs and so on, it's unclear. Dylan here suggests that maybe it's easier to catch a slug than a frog, and that might be the case. Maybe these are just very easy food items to collect, and therefore there's an evolved preference for them. So that's the sort of thinking that we have to do. Here's another example. So this is these are crickets, and they have they call for a period of time. That is that the males are calling for females. Basically, I should take a step back. The mating system of this group, of this species, or most crickets, is that the males will call, right? They rub their hind legs and make a call. And the females are attracted to this call. There are certain aspects of the call, right, that might be of interest. So how long they're calling for, that might be a way for females to assess the quality of the male. So mean call, there's variation, in many of these traits. So again, this shows you here two groups, and I'll explain what those groups are in a second. But you can see that some crickets call for a very long time and some for a very short period of time. So this is an example of continuous variation. And so you can conduct what we call an artificial selection experiment on call duration. What does that mean? And we'll do another couple of examples of this, but basically artificial selection occurs when you, for example, bring in these crickets into the lab, you assess how long they call for. So each individual calls for a certain amount of time. You can separate out those males, for example, that call for a long period of time and those males that call for a very short period of time. And then you can breed those separately. That is that you can breed long callers alone and breed the longest callers and then try and assess their offspring to see if their offspring have long calls, and do the same for those crickets that have short calls. And so if parents with long calls, in this case, can produce offspring that also have long calls, then that indicates that that the trait is heritable, right? That the parent is able to confer or to bequeath the behavior to its offspring through its genes. So that suggests that it's a heritable trait, right? If you're able to do this kind of artificial selection experiment where you can get the extremes of these populations to, if they breed and are able to pass on those traits to their offspring, then you can produce two, in this case, separate lines of crickets, one that is producing very short calls and one that's producing very long calls. And that's what this is doing here. So this is a series of generations of selection looking at calling duration in crickets. And after 1, 2, 3, and 4 generations of this artificial selection, where you breed in the long calling crickets and you separately from the short calling crickets. And you can see here, so the arrows indicate the average calling duration for each of the two groups. So at the first generation, this is the collection of all of the crickets. And you can see that, the average for all the crickets is around 5, let's say, calls per hour, or no, sorry, their calling time is in hours. So they're calling for about 5 hours. And after one generation of selection, you can see that there already is movement in terms of away from the average. So the crickets that are being selected for longer calls have shifted to the right here so that they are all calling for a longer period of time. The short duration callers are calling for a much shorter period of time. And you can see that after 3 and 4 generations, pretty soon you have a line of crickets that's only calling for 1.5 hours versus a line of crickets that's calling for 6 hours, thereabouts. So these are two lineages of crickets that have been subject to artificial selection. And what this suggests to you is that this calling duration is heritable. That is that you can, parents are transmitting the genetic information associated with calling duration to their offspring. And they're doing this through their genes. This is another example, which is, which I find fascinating, frankly. But this is nest building behavior in house mice. So this is a bit easier, perhaps, not easier to understand, but certainly more compelling to think about than perhaps crickets or snakes. But these are house mice, and house mice, they make nests for their offspring, of course, and that nesting material has to be gathered. And there's variation in how much nesting material a particular mother collects for their nest. And so, you're looking at the ratio of minimum to maximum. So it's about between 13 and 18 grams of cotton in a 4-day period. That's the average, for the average mouse that you see. So what happens if you were to do an artificial selection experiment with this? That is that, what if you took, the females that produce or nests with, on the smaller end of the scale, like in terms of the amount of material, so say 13 grams, and then, generation after generation, you pick the females that use the least amount of nesting material and breed those, and do the same for the larger amount of nesting material. And then after generation, let's say about 10, 20, 30 generations, what would it look like? Well, here's 10 generations of artificial selection on mice and on this behavior of nest material, or the gathering of nesting material. So first of all, in green, there is a control. So these are mice that are basically left alone. They breed on their own. There's no significant, there's no artificial selection. In red here is the one or two lineages of the high collection. So that is that the females that were selected to breed in this line, these lines here, were the ones that were collecting the most nesting material. Whereas in the blue here, that's the least amount of nesting material. And the point here is like these high line, this is the high line being like the females that collect the most material, produce these massive nests, as you can see, versus the low line, which is these mice are producing very, very small nests. So what does this mean? This means that this gathering behavior, this nest material gathering behavior is heritable. That is that there is a genetic, underlying genetic variation associated with this trait, this behavioral trait. Right? By mating, only these mice that have, collect very little nesting material or collect the least amount, you can produce a mouse after 10 or more generations of artificial selection. You can produce a mouse that has quite a different behavior compared to the ancestral mouse, if you will, the mouse that entered into the experiment. So through this breeding, you can, this just shows you that this behavior is in fact heritable, right? So that means that natural selection can act on this behavior and it is adaptive, right? That is that the natural variation that we see in this nest gathering behavior is an adaptation and has been subject to natural selection. There's another set of experiments that looks at aggression in mice. I think these are, these are mice. And so we can look at maternal aggression to intruding males. So females are obviously very protective of their offspring, and they will engage in aggressive behavior towards males that sort of approach their nest. And so we know that there is variation in several aspects of this behavior. So the time to the first attack, the total duration of aggression, and the total number of attacks are aspects of this maternal aggression behavior that can be quantified. And we know that they're variable. Some females are hyperaggressive, some females are less aggressive. So you can do a very similar artificial selection experiment. And this is just simply a diagram from the paper that this is taken from that articulates how the artificial selection experiment takes place. So you take 52 unrelated outbred mice, divide them up into two sets of families. You have one, they're labeled S and C, so selected and control. You have, you breed them, you test maternal aggression, and then the pups grow and you test the maternal aggression and you're able to select females with the highest aggression and breed those. That is, they are mated and then they produce offspring, and then you mate the offspring that have the highest maternal aggression themselves. And so this perpetuates this kind of line of mice that is going to, presumably, if it's a heritable trait, you're going to see an increase in this maternal aggression behavior in this particular line of mice. And that's what happens. So the selected mice, this is the number of generations from 0 to 8. -1 must be the very first generation, right? That gets in, I should say, it's the founding mice of the experiment are here at -1. And this is the amount of time spent being aggressive over a specific time period. And what you can see here is that as generations progress, and the selected line of mice, that is the mice in which only the most aggressive females are breeding, you can see that the average amount of time being aggressive is increasing That is, it's much higher than the control. And so again, this indicates that this aggressive behavior, this maternal aggression, is a heritable behavior. And that means that it is subject to natural selection. We assume, of course, that this behavior affects the fitness of these females, right? So if you're looking at natural levels of, or natural variation in this kind of behavior, we can argue that it's an adaptation. And we would just make some assumptions about its effect on fitness, and we would have to test that. But nonetheless, the point being here that this trait is heritable. That means that natural selection can act on it. What's interesting is that, in behavior, many of the genes that are associated with one behavior also affect others. And so we call this correlated evolution. And so in this case, there's evidence that the aggressive behavior that females may have towards intruders, the sort of maternal aggression, is also related to pup retrieval in some way. So, we can see if there is a relationship between pup retrieval. So this is obviously an important part of maternal care. Pup retrieval means that if a pup is moved from the nest, the mom goes out and collects that pup and brings it back to the nest. And so we can look at the relationship between aggression and pup retrieval. And what we find here is that the amount of time that it takes for a female to go out and retrieve its pup is higher in the aggression selected line of mice. That is, that in the sort of we'll call them hyper aggressive moms tend to take longer to retrieve their pups if they are taken out of the nest compared to a control. So there's a trade-off there, right? There's a trade-off between maternal aggression and this aspect of pup retrieval. So moms that are hyper aggressive are not, at defending their nest, are not terribly good at retrieving their pups. They take longer to retrieve their pups. So that just gives you a sense of how, there's many of these behaviors are in fact correlated with each other, in part because the same group of genes, or at least some of those same genes, are used in or are affecting different behaviors. Okay, we're going to talk about continuous variation in terms of people and intelligence. I'm not going to, we're not going to have time to finish it all today, so I'm going to stop here because I want to go through this in one big block. This is just so you don't get too alarmed. This is obviously a graph that has been misused. That is, what I mean is that this has been produced back, I don't remember, back in the 50s probably, but it's obviously something, that reflects the the controversial nature of our understanding of the heritability of intelligence, right? So in this particular graph, it seems to imply that white children have a higher IQ than black children. And so my point here is not to say that this is the truth, of course, but what I'm trying to point out with this graph is just to, how controversial our understanding, or how controversial trying to understand the heritability of something like intelligence can be, because it can be misused for, the kinds of graphs that you're seeing here. And so, like I said, I'm going to stop here, but on Monday, we'll walk you through, some of the evidence that relates to, our understanding of the heritability of IQ. We're going to talk a little bit about what IQ even is, and we'll talk about the controversies and some of the resistance to measuring these kinds of relationships. As you can imagine, it's not, there's lots of opportunity for people to misuse this kind of information and to misinterpret it, most specifically misinterpret much of this information. So we're going to I want to be pretty careful about walking through this with you when we do it all at once on Monday. Okay, so I'm going to give you a break here. We'll stop here. You'll have a break before the sort of 1 o'clock lab with the ethogram. The ethogram shouldn't take too long. I mean, you just plug away at it. And if you have any questions about it or whatnot, feel free to contact me or Brian. Brian is the TA, and he's probably your first point of contact for questions. And I think he's provided his email in that D2L news item that he posted with the Zoom link. So be sure that you contact him as well if you have questions. All right, any other questions?